Portugal was once a land continuously at the mercy of invaders, Celts, Romans, Muslims, only to become one of the earliest superpowers with an empire that spanned the globe, that fell into a slow decline, that culminated in a dictatorship, and which would eventually give way to democracy in the 1970s. To see why, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of Portugal. Portugal has been continuously inhabited since at least Mesolithic times, around 150,000 years ago. Evidence comes from Neanderthal bones found in Furninha, a cave north of Cape Cavoeiro, thousands of stone carvings in the Coa River Valley, and cave drawings of horses and other animals near Santiago de Escurao. In more recent times, various groups from antiquity began to arrive in the area. First came Celtic peoples from Central Europe, populating northern and western Portugal and creating dozens of castros or fortified villages starting around the first millennium BCE. One of their settlements, an outpost associated with the god Halia, later renamed Portuscale by the Romans, gave the country its name. The Phoenicians came next, creating trading outposts around what is now Lisbon and Faro, followed by the Greeks, who were also concentrated in the south, and finally the Carthaginians, who replaced the Phoenicians and closed access to the country to the Greeks. After the loss to the Romans during the First Punic War, the Carthaginians, under the command of Hamilcar Barca, set out to conquer the peninsula to make up for the lost territory. But in Portugal, their success was limited and were only able to control the southern area previously controlled by the Phoenicians and Greeks. The rest continued to be dominated by various Celtic tribes. Carthaginian control ended in the 3rd century BCE with the Second Punic War defeat to the Romans. The victors quickly transformed the former Carthaginian territory into a new province they called Hispania Ulterior and set out to expand into the rest of the peninsula. One of its early governors was Julius Caesar, and it was here that he enjoyed some of his first military conquests. But just as the Carthaginians before them, the Romans faced stiff resistance from indigenous peoples, especially the Lusitani, a Celtic warrior tribe who settled between the Rio Tejo and Rio Douro. One of the chieftains, Viriato, held up the Roman invasion for several decades, until 140 BCE, when the Romans bribed 3 of his own people to murder him in his bed. Without Viriato, Lusitanian resistance collapsed, and Rome conquered the rest of the region relatively quickly. Much later, the Portuguese would embrace Viriato as the first national hero. What is now Portugal would remain under Roman rule for 600 years, divided between the colony of Lusitania and Galicia, which covered not just northern Portugal but present-day Galicia, Asturias, and León. The impact was profound. Locals were organized into jurisdictions and forced to move to citanias, that is, Roman towns. Roads and bridges were built to connect the main towns like Olisipa, present-day Lisbon, and Bracara Augusta, present-day Braga. A senate was established at Évora, present-day Évora. Industries such as brickmaking, tile-making, and iron smelting were developed. Wheat, barley, olives, and vines were introduced, and monuments such as the Temple of Diana in Évora were erected. Most importantly, the Romans bequeathed future Portugal with its language. Portuguese is derived from Latin, and its majority religion, Christianity, not to mention the basis for its legal framework. The Roman system began to unravel in 406 AD when various Germanic tribes, the Romans called barbarians, including the Vandals and Suevi, invaded the Iberian Peninsula and began to spread west. The Vandals didn't last long, but the Suevians decided to settle first in Galicia, where they created a kingdom anchored around Braga, and would later expand under King Richila, managing to dominate a large part of the peninsula by 546 AD. This was quite short-lived, however, as the Visigoths, the most highly Romanized of the Germanic peoples, had been commissioned by the Romans to restore its hegemony and would defeat the Suevi in 458 AD under the leadership of its king Theodoric, limiting their expansion and eventually annexing them entirely in 588 AD. Visigoths would then gradually mix with the Suevians and Hispano-Romans into a single political religious entity, especially after 642 AD when this Visigothic code was promulgated, which ended all legal differences between them. Visigothic rule of the entire peninsula, centered around their capital of Toledo, would last for nearly 2 centuries. The end came because internal conflicts over succession developed in the latter part of the 7th century, which left the ruler, King Roderick, in a precarious position. Seeing an opportunity, the Umayyad Caliphate, a neighboring Muslim people that had been aggressively expanding outward from the Arabian Peninsula since the death of Muhammad, invaded in 711 AD and quickly reached the Visigothic capital. Within 5 years, future Portuguese land, Évora, Santarém, and Coimbra, fell to the Muslims, leaving the entire peninsula in their hands, except for a tiny sliver in Asturias in the very north. The territory controlled by the Muslims would be under Islamic rule for slightly over 7 centuries, first as part of the Caliphate of Damascus, and later in 756 as an independent kingdom with its capital in Córdoba, Spain. Known as Al-Andalus, it would experience a golden age for 250 years as the caliphs founded schools and libraries, cultivated the sciences, particularly mathematics, introduced arabesque decoration into local architecture, explored mines, developed commerce and industry, built irrigation systems that transformed many arid areas into orchards, and left a deep imprint in the language and culture. In western Al-Andalus, this was particularly concentrated in the south, in places like Algarve, an area that Muslims preferred because of its drier climate and land better suited for their crops. Silves and Mertola, some of the most important towns during this period, still retained fortifications and a mosque that Muslim rulers built. Muslim control began to ebb in the 11th century, when local nobles began to carve up the caliphate into independent regional city-states known as taifas. The most important of these were the emirates of Badajoz, Mérida, Lisbon, and Évora. These internecine struggles provided the opportunity the Christian kingdoms of the north had been waiting for to go on the offensive and reconquer the peninsula, what the Portuguese call Reconquista. To be sure, resistance to Muslim rule had never really ended. In fact, the traditional start for this process is usually given as 722 when the Christians won the Battle of Covadonga and established the Kingdom of Asturias under King Pelayo. Ever since then, there was constant war along the borderlands and occasionally beyond them, as the various Christian kingdoms tried to expand into Muslim territory. Lisbon, for instance, was taken and lost to the Caliphate again multiple times, including in 851 and 1093 AD. Portugal, as an independent entity, also emerged from this process. It was originally carved out as a province of the Kingdom of Leon. It then became a vassal state with its own king in 1096 AD, and finally became fully independent in 1128, after a rebellion by Afonso Henriques put the Portuguese fully in control. It would still take a few years and more wars, but by 1143 he would be recognized as the legitimate monarch by Leon, and in 1179 by the Pope himself. It helped that divisions plagued Al-Andalus, and thus was able to keep enlarging his realm. And thus Portugal was able to keep enlarging the realm, with the biggest prize being Lisbon in 1147. Afonso's heirs continued his quest, expanding Portuguese territory into the Algarve in the early 13th century. The last of the Muslims were kicked out from present-day Portuguese borders in 1249, when one last enclave, that of Faro, fell to Afonso III. Thus, the Portuguese Reconquista ended nearly 250 years before the Spanish equivalent. During that time, a number of important developments occurred. Most importantly, the crown found a way to limit the powers of the church and the nobility, especially that of the religious military orders like that of the Templars, and paved its way for an absolute monarchy even while allowing certain accommodations like the creation of the Cortes, a type of parliament in 1211. Most crucially, when Portugal was threatened by annexation to Castile after the death of Ferdinand I left the throne without an heir, Portuguese troops fought back against Castilian intervention, and their triumph at the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385 not only consolidated Portuguese independence, but also established a new dynasty, the House of Aviz, which would go on to lead Portugal to superpower status. The main reason was Portugal's naval superiority, which in turn had multiple causes, including the country's location at the trading crossroads between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, the perfection of key technologies like the astrolabe and quadrant, the invention of the Latin-rigged caravel, and the creation of a system of maritime insurance. All of this, coupled with a lack of available land to expand to and interest in the spice trade, which had been threatened by the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, led to the development of a mighty Portuguese navy. Aiming to find a direct way to India, Portugal came up with a plan to circumnavigate Africa to reach India directly, most notably under Prince Henrique of Portugal, better known as Henry the Navigator. Systematically, they began mapping the African coast, setting up trading posts as they went, and colonizing previously uninhabited islands they discovered, including the Azores in 1427, Cape Verde in 1444, and Sao Tome and Principe in 1470. Their efforts paid off in May 1498 when Vasco da Gama reached present-day Kerala in India, opening up a lucrative trade that would make the Portuguese crown one of the early colonial powers as they continued to increase their presence along the route to India. including Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, Angola, and Mozambique. In 1510, they would also set up a permanent enclave in Goa, along with several other settlements in India, having successfully fought off the Ottoman Turks for commercial dominance in the region, and soon after expanding even to the Moluccas, the Spice Islands themselves. The most important future colony, however, ended up being Brazil, discovered in 1500 when on its way to India, Pedro Álvares Cabral sailed too far west and ended up in what he originally thought was an island, but soon realized was a new continent. Beyond the riches access to India gave the crown, the Portuguese also pioneered sugar plantations, first in the islands they controlled off the coast of Africa, and later in Brazil, as well as the Atlantic trade in enslaved Africans, as they were the labor that would sustain their sugar plantations. Both would be immensely profitable. Soon, Lisbon would be the commercial capital of the world, and the Portuguese a power to be reckoned with. Unfortunately for the Portuguese, the newfound wealth neither transformed the country's social structure, nor did it create the basis for further economic development. Instead, Asian imports weakened much of the local industry. A lot of the money was wasted on sumptuous palaces and churches. Even worse, they lost important skills when they persecuted Jews and centralized so much power in the crown that the ability of the king was crucial for the overall empire. This became a huge problem when in 1578, King Sebastian was lost in action in an ill-fated attempt to conquer Morocco, leading to a dynastic crisis that would eventually pave the way for an Iberian union between 1580 and 1640. This period, what the Portuguese call Spanish captivity, led to the deterioration of the empire, not just from neglect, but because Portugal became party to Spain's wars with Britain and Holland, which saw them lose their commercial monopoly in India to the British and in the Far East to the Dutch, and almost lose Brazil, but for heroic resistance from the locals. A rebellion in 1637 against the Spanish paved the way for the crowning of João, Duke of Bragança, in 1640, restoring the country's independence and creating a new dynasty that would rule until the 20th century. It would still take a 28-year-old war of Portuguese restoration, with the decisive battle at Montes Claros in June 1665, but in 1668, the Habsburgs finally recognized Portuguese independence. The return of the monarchy reinvigorated the empire somewhat, especially during the Marquês de Pombal period. The Marquis, a commoner named Sebastião de Carvalho Melo, who became the chief minister of King José I, gained absolute power and tried to force Portugal to modernize, especially after the Great Lisbon earthquake of 1755. But he gained too many enemies when he expulsed the Jesuits from the country in 1759 and was expelled from power himself in 1777 by a new monarch, Maria I. The Napoleonic Wars dealt another blow to the Portuguese Empire. Several French invasions forced João VI and his court to move to Brazil, a development that elevated the former colony to equal status with Portugal. Resentment over this and Portugal's status as a British protectorate sparked what came to be known as the Liberal Revolt of 1820, a process led by military officers that set up a new liberal constitution in 1822 and forced João VI to return to Europe and try to reinstitute Brazil to its colonial status. This in turn led Prince Pedro, who had stayed behind to rule, to declare Brazil independent in 1822. To complicate things further, in 1826, João died unexpectedly, probably poisoned. Pedro was direct heir, but given that neither Brazil nor Portugal wanted to be reunited under a single monarchy, he developed a less liberal charter and abdicated in favor of his daughter with the condition that she would marry his brother Miguel and respect the new constitution. Miguel seemed to agree, but soon after declared himself king and tried to return Portugal to absolutism. Pedro responded with war. He rallied the liberals and forced the Miguelistas to surrender in May 1834. The liberal triumph did not solve the country's political problems, however. For one thing, Pedro died only a few months later, leaving 15-year-old Maria as queen. For another, liberals were still divided amongst themselves between the radicals who wanted to return to the 1822 constitution and the moderates who were okay with the 1826 charter. This led to significant political instability, and the country came to the brink of another civil war. But a compromised new constitution in 1836 ironed out some of the problems, and by 1856, a new era known as rotativismo began when the radicals, now known as progressives, and the moderates, now known as regenerators, institutionalized an informal system where they alternated in power. Stability brought improvements. Women gained the right to own property, the prison system received an overhaul, and the death penalty was abolished. Portuguese colonies also received more attention. With the goal of creating a new Brazil, slavery was abolished there in 1869. and efforts were made to cement their African claims in the face of competing encroachments by other European powers, especially Britain. The British, however, had other ideas, and in 1890 gave them an ultimatum that forced the Portuguese to remove their troops from land connecting Angola to Mozambique. This humiliation, in turn, significantly boosted the Republican opposition, which saw the monarchy as antiquated and an obstacle to modernity. Things soon changed. First, there were bankruptcies in 1892 and 1902, which caused serious economic disruption, to which the king responded by appointing João Franco as prime minister and granting him dictatorial powers. Next, there was a failed Republican coup in 1908 known as the Intentona do Elevador. And finally, there was the assassination of King Carlos I and his heir, Luís Felipe, as they rode through the Terreiro do Passo in the heart of Lisbon. The king's death dealt the final blow to the monarchy. His son, Manuel II, tried to appease the Republicans by removing João Franco, but it was too little too late. On October 5, 1910, a new revolt that the Portuguese military refused to put down overthrew the monarchy, forced King Manuel into exile in London, and changed Portugal's flag to include the Republican colors, green and red. After a landslide victory in the 1911 elections, hopes were high among Republicans for dramatic changes ahead, but the tides were against them. The economy was in tatters, an issue only exacerbated by an economically disastrous decision to join the Allies in World War I that gained Portugal little. In post-war years, the chaos deepened. Republican factions squabbled, unions led strikes and were repressed, and the military grew more powerful. The new republic soon had a reputation as Europe's most unstable regime. Between 1910 and 1926, there were an astonishing 45 changes of government, often resulting from military intervention. There were even multiple attempts to restore the monarchy, most notably in 1919 when the Monarquía do Norte was established in the northern part of the country for about a month. Another coup in 1926 brought one of the most dominant political figures in Portuguese history, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, a finance minister who would rise up through the ranks to create a dictatorship that he called Estado Novo, or New State, under a French constitution in 1933. A former professor of economics at the University of Coimbra, Salazar never married, lived austerely, and was never all that popular, but was well respected. He would rule for almost 4 decades, including during World War II, where he played both sides. Salazar's Portugal was a corporatist republic that was nationalistic, Catholic, authoritarian, and essentially repressive. All political parties were banned except for the Loyalist National Union, which ran the show, and the National Assembly. Strikes were banned, and propaganda, censorship, and brute force kept society in order. The sinister new secret police, Polícia Internacional de Defensa do Estado, or PIDE, inspired terror and suppressed opposition by imprisonment and torture. Various attempted coups during Salazar's rule came to nothing. In part, this was because for all the suppression, the new state did bring some economic improvement, more than quadrupling GDP per capita between 1933 and 1973, although most of this growth was concentrated from the 1960s on. In the end, what brought down the Salazar regime was not its authoritarian tactics in Portugal, but rather decolonization. The dictator refused to give up the colonies, and maintaining them became costlier and costlier. This left the army overstretched and with lots of unhappy officers. Even worse for the regime, Salazar died in 1970, 2 years after having a stroke and falling into a coma. A cadre of leftist military officers, known as the MFA, then initiated a coup against Salazar's successor, Marcelo Caetano, on April 25, 1974. Unexpectedly, this received massive popular support. The event became known as the Carnation Revolution. This began a transition to democracy and a process that granted independence to the remaining Portuguese colonies. Since then, the country has been dominated by 2 parties, the confusingly named Social Democratic Party, which is actually on the right, and the Socialist Party on the left. Every single prime minister since 1980 has been a member of one of the 2, except for about a month at the end of that year when Freitas do Amaral became prime minister after Sá Carneiro, founder of the Socialist Party, died in a plane accident. Although it is the Socialists, under the leadership of Antonio Costa, who have been especially dominant lately, even winning a surprising victory in 2022. Meanwhile, the shift to democracy has not been a smooth one for Portugal. Corruption has been a constant throughout. There have been multiple scandals including espionage, money laundering, mismanagement of public funds, and so on. And even after joining the European Union in 1986, its economy has suffered widespread strikes, unemployment, and brutal austerity measures at different points. This was especially true during the 2008 financial crisis, which hit the country hard. Growth finally returned in the mid-2010s, only to have COVID bring another massive contraction. Today, the country has the 15th largest economy in Europe, just above Greece, and far below Spain's, which is over 5 times larger. A far cry from where it was during Portugal's golden age. Still, Portugal seems to be on the right path. Its level of happiness has been trending higher for about a decade and is now the 56th happiest place in the world. Whether the country has finally surpassed its tumultuous past remains to be seen.